$50. That's all it said, scribbled on a piece of cardboard nailed to a broken fence beside an old gas station in the middle of nowhere. 3 shepherd pups. $50. People passed. Cars passed. Not one stopped. Until a cop, hollow-eyed and heart-numb, hit the brakes. He wasn't looking for anything. Not anymore. Not since the accident. But then, one of them barked. And not just any bark, a high, pleading yelp that cracked through memory like thunder over dry bone. It was the same bark his wife's dog made, the one that died with her. And that bark, that single sound, would unravel a secret buried deeper than grief, deeper than death, hidden in the quiet hills of Elk River. Before we begin, tell me, do you believe dogs remember the ones who loved them? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you believe that every creature 2 legs or 4 deserves a second chance, hit subscribe. Because the story you're about to hear might just remind you that family isn't always born. It's sometimes found on the side of the road in the rain, with a bark that sounds like home. The wind crawled low through the valley, dragging with it the heavy breath of a storm that had long since passed. It was late September in Elk River, Montana, the kind of town that looked like it had once mattered, then decided not to anymore. Most of its storefronts were boarded up, its sidewalks cracked like tired old skin. The sky was pale and indecisive, mottled with gray clouds smeared like charcoal sketches, while the sun flickered like a dying bulb above distant buttes. Ethan Granger, 38, sat behind the wheel of his county cruiser, engine idling low. His hair was once black, but now streaked with stress-colored gray at the temples. His face bore the kind of stubble that had lost its rhythm with shaving. Tall, broad-shouldered, he had the sort of presence that once made suspects straighten up and citizens feel reassured, but now his uniform hung slightly off his frame like he was forgetting how to wear it. His eyes, a wintry green, looked forward but never really saw. It had been 92 days since his wife, Ellie, was killed in a rain-slick car crash up in Red Elk Pass. A semi had jackknifed. Wrong turn, no warning, no goodbye. She was gone, and with her, Caleb, the old German shepherd she'd raised since he was a pup. Caleb had been a retired canine, loyal to the marrow, always following Ellie like a shadow made of muscle and patience. Ethan had been driving out of town to nowhere in particular. Some said grief made people run. He wasn't running, he was drifting. Somewhere between the city limits and the ghost of what was once his home, he saw it, a rusted gas station with one leaning pump, its roof eaten by rust and time. And then the sign. A splintered piece of cardboard, scrawled in black marker, 3 shepherd pups, $50, nailed to the side of a crumbling fence. They sat there, 3 tiny creatures in a taped-up cardboard box beside an overturned trash barrel. They looked barely 8 weeks old, their ears too big for their heads, coats still fuzzy and soft like uncombed wool. The box sagged slightly in the middle where moisture had seeped in. No leash, no food. No water, no people. Ethan squinted through the windshield. Then he noticed someone, a man, tall and wiry, wearing a tan overcoat that hung down to his knees, despite the warmth of the day. His face was hidden beneath a brimmed cap and oversized sunglasses. He stood behind the box just long enough to hammer the sign into the fence post. Then, without a glance around, he turned and walked behind the station. Ethan opened his door. By the time his boots hit gravel, the man was gone. He walked up to the box. 3 sets of eyes met him. One curious, one cautious, one blank as stone. The first pup leaner than the others was the one who looked most alert. His coat was a classic black and tan saddle pattern, his paws already oversized, suggesting he'd be a powerful adult. He let out a single short bark and tilted his head. This would be Ranger. He had a soldier's posture already. The second pup was smaller and paler in coat, his face round and nose twitchy. He was digging at the corner of the box with his little paws, his nails scraping desperately against the soaked cardboard. This was Milo, an anxious little ball of energy with too much thought and nowhere to put it. The last pup, however, didn't move at all. He was darker than the others, with a coat like burnt cedar and deep, haunted eyes. He sat perfectly still, watching Ethan like a statue watches time. This was Echo. Ethan knelt slowly. "You've got no business being out here," he murmured. His voice, dry from disuse, sounded foreign even to him. "Where's your owner?" Milo whined, low and desperate, and returned to scratching the box. Ranger stood up, growled faintly, and stared toward the direction the man had disappeared. Echo remained. Then, as Ethan rose to his feet again, brushing dirt from his knees, Echo barked. Not loud, not playful. It was a bark that punched through him like glass through skin. It was the same pitch, same tremble, same cadence as Caleb's bark when he was just a puppy, when he'd gotten separated from Ellie at the lake that one summer and had cried out for her from the shadows under the pier. Ethan remembered it vividly. He hadn't just heard that bark, he'd felt it. His breath caught. He took a step back, then forward again. Echo didn't move. But something about the angle of the pup's head, the slight tilt, the barely visible twitch in his brow, it was like he knew him, like he was waiting. Ethan's fingers trembled as he reached out, not to touch, but just to be close. Echo blinked once and tilted his head in exactly the same way Caleb used to when listening for his name. Ethan's stomach turned. Someone honked in the distance. Cars had begun driving past again, not stopping, not slowing. To them, it was just a box on the road. But Ethan had seen something else. He turned in place to look for the man again, but only the warped heat rising from the cracked pavement remained. No footprints, no noise. Ranger barked suddenly, 2 short bursts, then looked at the same empty direction where the man had vanished. Ethan crouched and examined the box again. There was no label, no collar, not even a scribble of contact info. Just pups. Left. He stood and hesitated. Every part of him told him not to do this. He had no room in his life for more ghosts, but the bark was still echoing in his ribs. Echo looked up again, and Ethan sighed. He opened the back of the cruiser. "All right, boys," he muttered. "Let's figure out what this means." The road back to Ethan's cabin cut through a tunnel of pine and cottonwood trees, their leaves beginning to curl with the first whispers of autumn. The cruiser rumbled over loose gravel, headlights swiping across moss-covered trunks and roadside weeds waving like hands in the wind. In the back seat, the 3 pups were quiet. Ranger sat tall with alert eyes, Milo curled into a tight ball, and Echo pressed his nose to the glass, unmoving, like he was already memorizing every turn. Ethan's home stood just off a dirt path 10 minutes outside of Elk River, a small, weathered log cabin nestled against a shallow bend in the creek. The paint had long since peeled from the porch rails, and moss clung to the shaded side of the roof like an old quilt. It wasn't much, just 2 rooms and a wide back deck, but it was the place Ellie had loved most. He parked under the cedar tree and left the engine running for a moment longer than necessary. The dogs didn't bark, they didn't whine. They waited. Inside, the house held that kind of silence you could taste, thin, heavy, and expectant. A photograph on the mantel, still slightly tilted, showed Ellie holding Caleb with her head thrown back in laughter. Ethan looked away. The dogs sniffed their way inside. Ranger moved confidently from room to room like mapping territory was second nature. He paused at each corner, tail straight, nose high. Milo darted under the kitchen table and popped his head out again with every unfamiliar sound, the groan of a floorboard, the hiss of the radiator. Echo, by contrast, didn't wander. He sat down in the entryway and stared at Ethan. "You keep doing that," Ethan muttered. "Like you know something I don't." He set out 3 mismatched bowls, 2 old metal ones from the garage and 1 cracked ceramic with a faded apple design that Ellie used to fill with trail mix. He filled each with water, then dropped kibble from an emergency bag he'd grabbed from the supply shed. The crunching of tiny teeth was the first real sound the house had heard in weeks. Later that evening, as dusk bled violet across the sky, Ethan stood outside with a beer in one hand and a notepad in the other. He hadn't written in months, not since the crash. The notepad had been Ellie's idea originally. A grief journal, she'd called it, though he'd told her it was dumb. Now he opened it for the first time. Day 1. Took in 3 shepherd pups. One barked like Caleb. Not sure what I'm doing. He stopped. Looked down at Ranger, who was marking the far corner of the yard with military precision. Definitely a ranger, Ethan said, almost smiling. Milo suddenly let out a short, sharp bark from the porch. He was facing the road, ears perked. Ethan turned, scanning the empty gravel path that led to the tree line. Nothing. Not even dust. Probably a rabbit, Ethan murmured, though his fingers tensed slightly on the bottle. Milo, unconvinced, gave one more bark and slipped behind Ethan's legs. When night fell, the cabin grew colder than expected. Ethan laid out an old blanket in the living room near the wood stove, but none of the pups settled there. Ranger curled under the windowsill by the front door, half watching and half dozing. Milo made a nest of socks in Ethan's closet and whined softly every time the wind howled. But Echo Echo was nowhere in sight. Ethan found him 10 minutes later, already on the bed, curled in a tight ball on the side Ellie used to sleep. He didn't bark or move, just lifted his eyes and stared again. The bed creaked under Ethan's weight as he sat down. "You don't make sense," he whispered. Echo shifted only to rest his chin gently on Ethan's thigh. For a long time, they sat like that. Ethan stared at the ceiling, the knot in his chest pulling tighter. In Echo's eyes, he swore there was something old something watching him. Not just a puppy, not just a rescue, something more. The house, for the first time in months, did not feel entirely empty. The next morning, Ethan stepped onto the porch with a cup of lukewarm coffee. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, and a thin fog clung low to the grass. Ranger was already awake, pacing the edge of the yard and sniffing with purpose. He stopped to pee on the same tree stump as yesterday. "Territory? Got it," Ethan nodded, sipping. Milo burst from the house moments later, tail wagging, then immediately froze ears up, nose twitching. A truck engine grumbled faintly in the distance. Milo growled low and took 2 steps toward the sound before retreating. A blue pickup passed by without slowing. Ethan frowned. No one usually drove this early out here. Inside, Echo sat upright by the window, following the truck with his gaze long after it had disappeared. Later that day, while clearing out the back shed for dog supplies, Ethan found an old leash. Frayed leather, chewed at the handle. Caleb's. He turned it over in his hands for a long moment. Then he hung it on a hook beside the back door. Maybe it was foolish to hope. Maybe these pups were just lost dogs with a strange bark. But something in him, something quiet and persistent, had begun to shift. That night, Echo returned to the bedroom uninvited. Ethan didn't stop him. The air in the attic tasted like old paper and time. Every breath Ethan took stirred up a ghost of something long-forgotten wood smoke. Dried leaves, the faintest trace of cedar. The wooden steps creaked beneath him, each groan echoing through the narrow shaft as he climbed. A single bare bulb dangled from the ceiling, its chain swinging slightly, casting a dull yellow light over boxes marked in Ellie's delicate handwriting. Summer 2015. Caleb's gear. Xmas decorations. He hadn't been up here in over a year, not since before the accident. Ethan's hand brushed along the edge of a shelf, collecting dust on his fingers. He moved past a stack of crates, then knelt beside an old wooden trunk, its metal hinges rusted and brittle. He hesitated before unlatching it. The lid gave way with a tired sigh. Inside were familiar things: Ellie's hiking boots, an old rain jacket she refused to throw out, a faded map of Glacier National Park. Tucked carefully beneath them, wrapped in a hand towel, was a leather collar. It was dark brown, weathered smooth at the edges, and the metal tag still clinked softly as Ethan turned it over. "Caleb," it read. Plain block letters, worn down with time. His breath hitched. He hadn't realized how much he'd forgotten the sound the tag made, like a whisper of movement just behind him. The smell of fur and forest clung faintly to the collar, locked in the folds of time. Just as his fingers curled around it, Echo, downstairs, let out a sudden high-pitched whine, followed by a bark short, exact, mechanical in its rhythm. One bark. Pause. 2 quick barks. Ethan froze. That was Caleb's command pattern. It had taken Ellie months to train him to respond to the same cadence Ethan used in patrol. No regular dog barked like that, at least not naturally. He stood slowly, the collar still in hand, and descended the stairs with leaden steps. Echo sat at the base, eyes locked on Ethan's. His ears were pinned back, but his posture was steady, protective even. His tail gave a single thump against the floorboards like punctuation. "You know this?" Ethan whispered, crouching and holding out the collar. Echo didn't move at first. Then, deliberately, he stepped forward and touched his nose to the tag. A soft whine escaped his throat again, but there was no fear in it. Just recognition. In the silence that followed, Ethan's thoughts tangled. He looked at Echo at his symmetrical markings, the amber gleam in his eyes, the intelligence too focused for a pup this young. "What the hell are you?" he muttered. A knock on the front door broke the moment in half. Ethan stood, still gripping the collar, and moved quickly to the door. Ranger was already there, standing stiff, his tail straight like a board. He emitted a low growl that vibrated through the wood. Peering through the side window, Ethan saw a man holding a cardboard box. Tall, broad-chested, with a crooked smile and a red windbreaker, the delivery man looked like someone from a small-town calendar ad. His name tag read Clay in faded Sharpie. Clay had a kind face, somewhere in his 40s, a few lines around the eyes, and the kind of beard that was always a day too long. His expression faltered slightly as he saw Ranger. "Hey, delivery from Pet Supply Express?" he called out, box wobbling slightly in his arms. "Someone placed an order yesterday for puppy food in a water dish?" Ethan blinked. "I didn't." Then it hit him. He'd left the site open on his phone the previous night. Must have hit confirm without realizing. He sighed and opened the door slightly. Ranger pushed forward, pressing his body against Ethan's leg like a warning. "He's just doing his job," Ethan told the dog quietly, then turned to Clay. "Thanks. Just leave it there." Clay nodded, placing the box carefully at the edge of the porch. "You've got shepherd pups?" he asked, peering in. Ethan didn't answer, but Milo picked that exact moment to bolt out from under the couch and bark twice from behind Ethan's knee. Clay chuckled. "Thought I heard some howling last night when I passed by. You live up here alone?" Ethan's gaze sharpened. "Yeah, always have." Clay lifted both hands in a no-harm-meant gesture. All right, just being friendly." Ethan closed the door a second after Clay turned away, locking it with a quiet click. Behind him, Ranger was still at the window, watching the road. Milo jumped at the sound of the deadbolt and ran in circles before crashing into a laundry basket. Echo had not moved. Later that afternoon, Ethan sorted through the attic box, collar still within reach. Milo, ever curious, darted under the old reading chair in the study and began to dig furiously at the rug. A cloud of dust puffed out, followed by a dull thud as his paw hit wood. Ethan sighed. "What are you?" Then he noticed it. A square in the floorboard, slightly raised, the edge worn smoother than the rest. He pulled the rug away completely. Milo stepped back, tail wagging. It was a hidden compartment, a shallow cavity built into the floor. Inside sat a battered shoebox, lid half cracked. Ethan lifted it gently. The cardboard was soft with age, the edges stained. Inside were old papers, some torn, others folded. One was a vet bill dated 4 years ago. Another was a dog training chart, but not Caleb's. The name at the top read Canine 113A, Echo. His blood chilled. There was no mistaking it now. The forest behind Elk River had a way of pressing in around you. It sent a blend of pine sap, damp earth, and old secrets. The trees stood tall like silent judges, casting long shadows that shifted slowly as the sun made its way westward. Ethan trudged through the undergrowth, boots crunching over fallen twigs, eyes scanning the moss-covered ground. Ranger led the way, nose low, tail stiff with purpose. Echo followed beside Ethan, silent and attentive, while Milo weaved erratically between shrubs and stumps, always curious, always restless. The path they followed wasn't marked on any map. It was a forgotten access road, barely more than a memory, now leading into what used to be the Whispering Pines Animal Outreach Center. The facility had been shuttered for over 3 years, but its name still floated in the back pages of local newspapers, associated with a string of closed-door investigations, whispers of misused funding, and rumors that the place had served a darker purpose than its name suggested. Ethan wasn't here just to investigate. He was here because something in him had to know. Ranger suddenly stopped. He pawed at the ground twice, then began digging furiously near the base of a rotting log. Dirt flew behind him in rhythmic bursts. Ethan watched, unsure whether to stop him until he saw something fabric-like poking through the earth. Ranger stepped back, chest heaving. Ethan knelt and gently pulled the object from the soil. It was a cloth handkerchief, stained and crumpled, but unmistakable in design. In the bottom corner, done in blue embroidery thread, was a single letter, E, slanted and flowing. The thread looped in the same way Ellie always signed her initials when labeling their things: towels, baking tins, even their camping gear. Ethan's breath caught. His fingers trembled slightly as he turned it over. It was hers. There was no mistaking it. Echo let out a low, quiet bark, almost a growl, but not threatening, more like recognition. He walked forward and sat by Ethan's side, his gaze fixed not on the cloth but on Ethan's face, as if to say, "You needed to see this?" He closed his hand around the cloth and stood, the weight of it far heavier than its threadbare fibers suggested. The sound of snapping twigs drew his attention behind him. Milo came trotting from the underbrush, tail wagging, a small metallic object clenched between his teeth. He dropped it at Ethan's feet. Ethan picked it up and examined it. A cracked GPS tracking chip, no larger than a coin. The casing busted and circuit board exposed to moisture. Its serial number was still visible but partially corroded. It looked like it had been buried for some time. Milo stood proudly, tail wagging like he'd just delivered the moon. "Good boy," Ethan muttered, pocketing the chip. From behind a line of pine trees, a voice called out, "That's not the first one found out here." Ethan turned sharply, instinctively stepping in front of the pups. A woman stepped into view, her hands raised in a friendly gesture. She was in her early 30s, slender but wiry, with sharp cheekbones and wind-blown auburn hair pulled back into a ponytail. A canvas camera bag was slung over one shoulder, and her jeans were streaked with dirt and moss. Her boots were mismatched in color, clearly second-hand. She had the look of someone who lived outside most of the time, someone used to going unnoticed. "I'm Janie Kerr," she said, "used to volunteer at Whispering Pines before they closed it down." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "You were part of the staff?" "Not exactly. I was 19. Did weekend shifts, cleaning kennels, feeding, brushing down rescues." Her voice was steady, but there was a brittle edge behind it. "Until I noticed certain dogs never made it back from off-site adoption events, or that some shipments came in at night when no one else was around." Ranger barked softly, a low rumble that mirrored Ethan's unease. Janie looked down at the dogs. "I remember a shepherd named Echo," she said. "Didn't think much of it then, just another code name, but he was different. Quiet, too obedient, like someone had trained the puppy to listen without ever being told what to do." Ethan didn't speak. Janie took a step forward. "You're not here by accident, are you?" "I don't believe in accidents anymore." She nodded once. "I come out here sometimes, just to remember. I left after they fired a tech for asking too many questions. A week later, he crashed his car into a ravine. No investigation, just gone." Ethan didn't ask her why she kept coming. He understood that need. the kind that gnawed at you until you followed it through mud and ghosts. Suddenly, Ranger growled again, this time louder. He turned sharply and began pacing toward a nearby ridge. Ethan followed, calling the others close. Ranger led them to a moss-covered outcrop, where the ground sloped gently into a half-hidden hollow between rocks. The entrance was narrow, like something that had once been dug and then forgotten. Inside, tucked just beneath the stone lip, lay a shredded tarp, half rotted through and nearly invisible under the pine needles. Under it, Ethan found an empty crate industrial-grade plastic, the kind used for transporting animals. On the side, stenciled in faded red paint, was a code, K90113A, Echo. Janie let out a breath. So it is him. Ethan didn't reply. His eyes were locked on the crate. Echo stepped forward and sniffed the rim, then looked up at Ethan, ears lowered slightly, as if uncertain whether he'd done something wrong. He reached down and touched Echo's head gently. "You were supposed to be someone else's tool," he said, "but you found me instead." The forest around them fell into a deep hush. Even the breeze seemed to hold its breath. The rain came lightly that morning, a soft hiss on the rooftop shingles and a mist clinging to the fields behind the cabin. The air was thick with that rich scent of wet bark and coppery earth. Ethan sat at the kitchen table with a stack of old documents spread before him, folders, scribbled notebooks, and manila envelopes pulled from Ellie's locked drawer, one he hadn't dared open until now. The drawer had been left untouched since her death, sealed like a tomb. Echo lay nearby, his gaze constantly flicking between Ethan and the pile of papers. Ranger kept pacing along the window, ears pricked, tail held stiffly low, unsettled by something unseen. Milo, meanwhile, had taken refuge beneath the couch again, where he often dragged Ethan's socks and an old tennis ball like trophies. Ethan opened a thin folder labeled K9 Project Outreach 2018. Inside was a cluster of photographs. Most were standard shots, dogs lined up in training, volunteers smiling awkwardly, field days, and group walks. But one image stopped his breath cold. It was taken in front of a large, red-brick building whispering Pine Center before the rot had set in. In the foreground, Ellie stood with her arm lightly resting on the shoulder of a woman Ethan didn't recognize. The stranger had dark brown hair tied in a sharp bun, eyes sharp and narrowed, a thin smile that looked more rehearsed than real. She wore a slate-gray trench coat, tailored to perfection, and her posture screamed authority. Scrawled in blue pen on the back of the photo, Ellie plus M. Crane, Fall Expo 2018. Ethan gripped the edges of the photo tighter. Melissa Crane, he muttered. The name had shown up in Janie's rambling accounts, whispered between statements like static behind the truth. He placed the photo on the table and turned it toward Echo. The reaction was immediate. Echo's fur rose along his spine. He bared his teeth in a silent snarl, body low and tight like a drawn bow. Then, with a deep-throated growl, he lunged forward and slammed his paw down on the photo, knocking it to the floor. His hackles stayed raised as he growled again, loud enough to wake Milo from his safe haven. "Easy," Ethan said softly, stepping between Echo and the fallen photo. "It's okay." But Echo's eyes remained locked on the image. That wasn't confusion. It was memory, recognition, fear. Ethan's pulse quickened. He knelt and picked up the photo, brushing off the paw print left behind. "What did she do to you?" he whispered. Outside, Ranger barked twice, a short warning call. Ethan stepped out to the porch, Echo on his heels. The rain had softened into mist, and the trees across the yard stood still, but Ranger was growling, standing rigid beside the fence that lined the back property. Ethan approached and noticed a metallic glint buried in the fence's bottom beam. He knelt and, using a flathead screwdriver from the shed, pried it loose. It was a pinhole camera, no larger than a thumb. Taped beneath one of the slats, its battery still faintly blinking red. "Jesus," Ethan hissed. Who was watching him, and for how long? That night, back inside, Milo bounced around the couch again, agitated. His tail whipped side to side and his nose kept burrowing into the cushion seams. Ethan lifted one of the pillows, one that had belonged to Ellie, and found a folded scrap of paper tucked deep between the fabric lining and the stuffing. He unfolded it. The handwriting was blocky and sharp, written in pencil. "Don't trust the brown-haired woman. She lies with her eyes." It was unsigned. Ethan sat down, the note resting on his knee. The fire in the hearth crackled and popped, casting flickers of light across the cabin's walls. He turned on his laptop, pulling up the last email Janie had sent him. Ethan digging deeper. Melissa Crane had ties to a private contractor group in Virginia, Arcos Dynamics. Public front was dog training for high-security zones, but there were whispers of unauthorized genetic breeding trials and behavioral manipulation. They shut down the facility after a security failure. No official records exist, but I found a name. Echo was one of the listed prototypes. His stomach turned. The dots were starting to connect, and the image forming between them looked a lot like Ellie had known something she shouldn't have. He looked down at Echo, who now sat curled beside the fireplace, head resting on his front paws, eyes dim but alert. "You knew her," Ethan said aloud. "You remember her." Echo didn't move, but his tail gave a faint twitch, the kind of motion that said, "Yes, but I don't want to." The wind rolled hard through Elk River that evening, shaking branches against the windows and stirring dry leaves into miniature whirlwinds across the gravel road. Inside the cabin, the air had gone still enough that Ethan could hear the soft ticking of the kitchen clock and the occasional creak of the roof, but beneath the quiet hum of everyday life, something darker had begun to stir. Shadows no longer looked like simple outlines of trees. Every knock at the door felt a second too long. Every whisper of wind too much like breath. Ethan sat alone at his desk, a stack of FBI files open in front of him. He had received them via a secure link from a contact in the bureau, someone who owed him a favor. The information was classified, but the contents shook him in a way he hadn't felt since Ellie's accident. Melissa Crane, once director of Whispering Pines, was listed as a suspected operative of Project Arcus A private sector mentorship program that was in fact a covert canine trafficking and behavioral modification operation. The dogs were bred for obedience, endurance, and silence traits sought after by private militaries and clandestine government contractors. The project had reportedly ended after security and ethical concerns, but the documents said what Ethan already suspected. Not all the dogs were accounted for, and 3 had disappeared in the same week Whispering Pines was shut down. 3 pups, black and tan, 1 unusually quiet, 1 hyper-reactive, 1 with instinctive territorial control. Sound familiar? Ethan looked at the 3 of them now. Milo dozed beneath the bookshelf, paws twitching. Ranger lay at the front door, head on his paws, ears rotating like small radar dishes. And Echo, as always, sat nearest to Ethan, unmoving, unreadable, yet always watching. Outside, the wind howled again, and then Milo barked. It wasn't sharp or loud, it was almost surprised. A short woof, followed by frantic scratching near the back porch. Ethan stood and followed the sound to where Milo was digging near a stack of firewood beside the shed. The pup turned to him, tail wagging. A strange aluminum glint caught in his mouth. Ethan knelt, pried it gently from the dog's teeth. It was a USB flash drive, carefully wrapped in aluminum foil, sealed in an old Ziploc bag. The foil had been torn slightly by Milo's teeth, but the rest was intact. His heart raced. He went inside, inserted the drive into his laptop. A folder appeared. Ellie/personal. Inside were voice memos. Dozens. He clicked on the first. "This is Ellie. March 3rd. They're not what they claim. These pups, they respond to commands that haven't even been taught yet. It's like their memories are borrowed. One of them barks just like Caleb did. The pattern, the pause, it's exact. It doesn't make sense." Ethan froze. His fingers hovered above the mouse. She knew. He clicked the next. I'm being watched. Melissa hasn't said it outright, but I know she knows I've seen too much. I'm going to document everything and store it off-site. If anything happens to me if I disappear, don't believe it was an accident. Tell Ethan. Tell him to find Echo. The screen blurred as tears welled up in Ethan's eyes. He closed the laptop. His fingers clenched around the edges of the desk. Echo, who had inched closer, laid his head gently on Ethan's knee. You were hers, Ethan whispered, and she sent you to me. Outside, Ranger suddenly barked, loud, urgent. A long, low growl followed, deep from his chest. Ethan bolted to the window. A black SUV had pulled onto the road just outside the property, no plates, just tinted windows and high beams still on. It idled for a moment, then reversed slowly, and turned away. Ranger continued barking long after the vehicle disappeared. Ethan stepped outside, heart pounding, and examined the dirt road. Fresh tire tracks, deliberate. Someone was watching. Later that night, Ethan couldn't sleep. Restlessness scratched at him from the inside. He walked the property with a flashlight, the beam sweeping over the yard, the trees, the edges of the fence. As he rounded the back of the cabin, Echo barked once, sharp and directed, then trotted toward a patch of overgrown brush near the garden where Ellie once grew herbs. The lavender had long since been overtaken by weeds, but its scent still lingered faintly in the dirt. Echo pawed gently at the soil, then stopped. Ethan stepped forward, knelt beside him. There was a collar buried halfway beneath the ground, worn old but unmistakably Caleb's. It still had the faded silver tag, bent at the edge, and tied around it, looped like a makeshift bow, was a lavender ribbon, now stained with time. She brought you here, Ethan said under his breath. She brought all of you. Echo whimpered softly, pressing his body against Ethan's side. Milo ran over a moment later and flopped into the grass beside them. Ranger circled the area twice before sitting facing the road, as if waiting for something more. The ghost of Caleb wasn't in the collar, or the bark, or the dirt. He was in them, in their eyes, their instincts, the way they found Ethan exactly when he needed someone to keep breathing for. And Ellie somehow had made sure of that. The sky cracked open just after sundown. Rain poured down in heavy sheets, pelting the tin roof of Ethan's cabin like a war drum. The windows blurred with water and wind. Thunder rolled in the distance, but closer still was the hum of tires on wet gravel. Ethan knew before he looked. She was coming. Ranger stood by the door, his body stiff, growl low and deep in his throat. Milo paced nervously from window to window, ears twitching, tail low. Echo had taken his usual place beside Ethan's chair, but his muscles were tight, and his gaze never left the front of the house. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps. Confident. Not asking, but announcing. Ethan opened the door slowly. There she stood. Melissa Crane, hair soaked but still tied back, her trench coat clinging to her slender frame. Her face was pale under the porch light, but her expression held the same cold certainty he had seen in the photo. She was in her early 40s, composed and clean despite the storm, the kind of woman who had long ago learned to walk through chaos like it belonged to her. Flanking her were 2 men in black jackets, both tall, both broad, both expressionless. One had a jagged scar on his neck, the other a military buzz cut and a slight twitch in his left eye. Neither looked local. "We've come for the dogs," Melissa said, voice smooth as rain on glass. "They're not yours," Ethan replied. She stepped forward. "They belong to a program you don't understand. They were never meant for this." Her eyes flicked down at Echo, who now stood rigid, his teeth bared. "You're tampering with federal property." Ranger stepped between Ethan and the porch. He barked once, loud and sharp. Milo mirrored him with a second bark, jumping to the side as if preparing to distract. Echo gave one look to Ethan, then tugged gently at the hem of his jeans, just as he had done before, pulling him backward, just in time. The man with the scar lunged, but Ethan had already moved. Milo barked wildly, zigzagging toward the attacker's legs. The man stumbled, losing balance. Echo rushed in, growling ferociously, while Ranger launched forward and planted himself directly in front of Ethan, tail stiff, head lowered. Before the man could recover, red and blue lights lit the trees behind them. A sharp command pierced the night. "Drop him! Now!" Sheriff Dan Orville emerged from his squad car, soaked to the bone, his Stetson crushed in one hand. Dan was a broad-chested man in his 60s, with deep lines carved around his mouth and eyes that had seen more than they ever told. He was the kind of sheriff who didn't like paperwork, but hated injustice more. His brown jacket bore the Elk River patch now darkened with rain. Behind him stepped Agent Faye Lanning, a no-nonsense FBI field agent in her late 30s. Tall, lean, with close-cut blonde hair and a voice that cut through noise like a blade through cloth. She raised her badge as she strode up the steps. "Melissa Crane, you are under arrest for conspiracy, trafficking, and animal cruelty under Federal Statute 137B. Hands where we can see them." Melissa's mask cracked. "You don't know what you're interfering with." Echo barked 3 times in perfect sequence. Faye turned. "What was that?" Ethan's voice was quiet. "Emergency code. My wife trained a K-9 years ago. That bark pattern was for backup needed immediately." Echo learned it somehow. Melissa's eyes flicked between them. Her mouth twisted, but she said nothing. Sheriff Dan cuffed her himself. The 2 men didn't resist once the badges appeared. They were too well trained to challenge a fight they couldn't win. Inside, as the storm raged, Ethan sat near the fire. The adrenaline was fading now, replaced with the heavy ache of everything he had held back for too long. Echo sat beside him, eyes half-lidded, head resting on Ethan's boot. Milo pawed at the floor near the fireplace. At first, Ethan thought he was just restless, but then he noticed a small plank slightly raised from the others. He pulled it up. Inside was a paper-wrapped parcel, tied with simple twine. Watermarked stationery, Ellie's handwriting. "If you're reading this, it means you found them. It means they chose you." Beneath the letter, neatly folded, were 3 small certificates' birth papers, altered and anonymized. One had Echo's serial number. Another had Milo's paw print. The 3rd Ranger's had a date that matched 2 days after Ellie's last known visit to Whispering Pines. Ethan's breath caught. Ranger, who had been quiet since the confrontation, suddenly stepped forward. He pawed at an old wooden box tucked beneath the side table one Ethan hadn't opened in years. Inside were Ellie's documents journals, dog training guides, and at the very bottom, a yellowed file labeled Modified Adoption, WP. He opened it. Paper clipped inside was a list of candidate dogs for transfer, 3 of them marked Removed from Registry per EL. She had done it. Ellie had risked everything to rescue them. Echo looked up at Ethan, and something passed between them. No longer mystery, but knowing. The courtroom was quiet, solemn in the way old wooden places often are. Walls paneled in dark oak, ceiling fans slowly spinning, sunlight slipping through high windows and catching in the dust that hung in the air. Ethan sat at the table in his best uniform, the navy one, with clean brass buttons and his old badge pinned at the heart. The sleeves were just slightly too tight now, his shoulders broader from weeks of working the land, lifting dogs, rebuilding fences. The 3 shepherds sat in a row behind him. Ranger was first upright, disciplined, still, and sharp-eyed. He wore a thin service harness now, marked "In Training" in white. A handler named Deputy Joel Mercer, mid-30s, short-cropped blonde hair and a warm but focused demeanor, had taken an interest in Ranger after the arrest. Joel was a PTSD recovery coach for veterans, and Ranger had already passed his initial tests with remarkable ease. Beside Ranger sat Milo, leaning slightly against a girl no older than 10. Her name was Maya, small and pale, with a soft pink scarf tied around her ponytail and a stuffed rabbit clutched in one hand. She was one of the children at the Elk River Community Therapy Center. Milo had become her shadow during visits. Playful, gentle, calm in chaos. And, Finally, Echo. He sat closest to Ethan. No leash, no harness, just presence. Quiet and unwavering. The judge, Honorable Teresa Vaughn, was in her early 60s, slender, with silver-gray hair neatly tied in a bun and square glasses resting low on her nose. She had been a family court judge for over 2 decades and had a reputation for being firm but fair, deeply intuitive, especially with cases involving children, and in this case, dogs that were more than just animals. She looked up from the folder and met Ethan's gaze. "Sergeant Granger, you're not requesting a conventional adoption. You're not the legal next of kin, nor is there any blood relation between yourself and the canines in question. Are you aware of the significance of this declaration?" "I am, Your Honor," Ethan replied. "And still, you wish to proceed?" Ethan stood. He didn't bring notes. He didn't need them. "I lost my wife in an accident nearly 4 months ago," he began, his voice steady but low. "And with her, I lost a part of myself. Caleb, our shepherd, died in the crash too. He was family, not a pet, not a tool, family." He paused. Echo shifted just slightly, as if reminding him to keep going. "These 3 Ranger, Milo, Echo, they didn't just walk into my life. They saved it. They showed up on a day I didn't know I needed saving. They were abandoned, programmed, trained, used, but somehow they still chose to trust me, to love me." A hush fell deeper across the room. "I didn't raise them. I didn't buy them. I didn't even name them at first. But they're mine, not because I own them, because we found each other, and I would give anything to keep them safe. I don't know if that makes me their father, or their pack, or just the man lucky enough to be chosen by them." He glanced down at Echo, who met his gaze calmly. "But I know this," he said. "Family isn't blood. It's the ones who stay, the ones who look at your broken pieces and lie beside you anyway." The judge tapped her pen once, gently. There were no objections, no motions to deny, only the quiet scribble of the gavel's shadow. "I have heard enough," Judge Vaughn said softly. "The court recognizes your application and approves full guardianship and permanent placement for Ranger, Milo, and Echo. May you continue to be the home they were always meant to find." Outside the courthouse, the sun had finally returned. Puddles sparkled in the light like glass fragments turned soft. Ethan opened the truck's door and helped the dogs hop in one by one. On the ride home, they passed the field where the first frost was beginning to silver the grass. The road ahead was smooth, stretching wide beneath a sky that had finally cleared. Back at the cabin, life resumed, but nothing was the same. Ranger had begun training with Joel 3 days a week, riding in patrol cars, attending workshops with veterans, learning to listen for changes in breathing, body tension, and silence. He was alert, protective, and fearless. His tail wagged more now, not wide and wild like Milo's, but firm and proud, like he'd earned it. Milo spent his days at the therapy center, comforting children during group sessions. He learned how to respond to overstimulation, how to guide children away from sensory overload, how to lay his head on a shaking lap and just breathe. He and Maya were inseparable now. Her laughter had returned, and Echo stayed. He didn't follow Ethan like Caleb had. He didn't cling like Milo or stand guard like Ranger. He simply existed beside him, every hour, every moment. At night, Echo slept curled on Ellie's side of the bed, his head resting lightly where her pillow once lay. Every morning, when Ethan brewed his coffee, Echo would sit by the back door, eyes on the forest. He wasn't waiting for danger. He was watching the world. One evening, as the sun dipped orange behind the trees, Ethan tossed a ball across the yard. Milo bolted after it, ears flopping. Ranger raced him, barking once in challenge. Echo stayed behind at first, then trotted after them not to chase but to join. And for the first time since all this began, all 3 tails wagged at once. Sometimes blessings don't arrive with thunder or trumpets. Sometimes they come in the form of muddy paws, soft eyes, and a bark that sounds just like the one you lost. In a world full of noise and chaos, it's easy to miss the quiet miracles, those subtle nudges from God reminding us that we are never truly alone. The story isn't just about a man and 3 dogs, it's about healing, about family that isn't made by blood, but by love, loyalty, and silent understanding. It's about how God can use the most unexpected companions to bring light back into the hearts of the broken. Ranger, Milo, and Echo were not just strays, they were divine messengers in fur, sent at the perfect time to restore what grief had taken. If you've ever felt lost, if you've ever prayed in the silence for a sign, maybe this is it. So before you go, take a moment. Say a quiet amen in the comments if you believe that every soul, whether 2-legged or 4, deserves love, purpose, and a second chance. Share this story if it touched your heart. Subscribe for more tales that honor the quiet heroes among us, both human and animal. And may God bless you, your family, and your furry companions with peace, joy, and unexpected miracles. And remember, love doesn't need a reason, just a heartbeat and a little bit of faith.